Hello, I'm Susan Nash, AAPG, and I'm delighted that I have the opportunity to introduce you to William DeMis. He's with Rochelle Court, LLC in Cypress, Texas, and he has agreed to reprise his very popular and standing room only presentation that he did at Image. So the name of his presentation is Monetary Pivot Points in the History of the US Dollar, Their Effects on Oil Prices, and the Coming Pivot. So thank you, Bill, and welcome.
Thank you, Susan. And uh, thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And let me just start with my talk. Ladies and gentlemen of AAPG, macroeconomic events that affect the US dollar affect all commodities, but none more so perhaps than the global oil industry, because oil is priced, traded, and sold around the world in US dollars. Monetary pivot points are critical macroeconomic events wherein the value of the dollar changes profoundly. And this, of course, has an effect on the price of oil. So today in my talk, I'm going to show you two monetary pivot points and how they affected the price of oil. And I'll also show the current monetary and fiscal mess that the US is in now and why means that we are actually in another pivot. It's not even coming, we're already in it. And I'm going to show how these macroeconomic events are going to affect the price of oil in the future. So I've been giving talks about monetary history and exchange rates and the price of oil for 30 years. This is not Goldman Sachs research that I did at Goldman. Today's talk is sort of a continuation of the talk I gave in 2021. Before that talk, AAPG required that I make a PowerPoint video. I gave that to AAPG and I also uploaded it to YouTube. Now, if you want to find that video, the only way you're going to really find it is by going out to my LinkedIn page. And I'm not saying that because I want clicks. It's just that there's a guy out there, a famous singer named DeMis. And if you go out to YouTube, you will find 8,000 of his videos and never find mine. This is the outline of my talk. In the introduction, I'm going to focus a lot on what I call the real global price of oil. And this will become important later on at the conclusion where I show some oil price projection scenarios. So let's start with the gold oil price, gold oil ratio. And back in the late 1900s, I showed the importance of this gold oil ratio. And I could talk about this slide for 2 hours. The only thing I want you to get out of this slide today is that throughout the OPEC era, on average, 1 ounce of gold bought about 12 barrels of oil. So if you plot up the price of oil on the left and the price of gold on the right in red, and you make the gold scale 12 times, you can see that the two curves kind of track each other. However, when they depart, when gold goes above oil on this plot, important things happen. So in 73, gold jumped above oil in this presentation and that in this graphing technique, and that was the mark of an oil boom. In 86, we had the price collapse. In 96, I pointed out this relationship and said, these two curves will come back together again. And that happened in 2002, and that was a soft start to the next oil boom, which then collapsed in 2014, and that's when the two curves became decoupled again. Today, oil prices are at about 65 and the price of gold has exploded. This would suggest that oil should be $285 a barrel for these two curves to remerge again. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think prices will get that high right now. I'm sticking to $200. And the reason for that is because, one, OPEC wants oil to be seen as an affordable and reliable energy. OPEC oil ministers want to reassure their customers of continuity of supply. And more important, just as important, is that my analysis continues to support about $200 oil. So here is the real global price of oil. It's the price of oil corrected for inflation and for changes in the value of the US dollar. The real global price of oil is actually measuring oil's value or purchasing power. It shows what is the purchasing power of a barrel of oil anywhere in the world. Shown by the lavender line is the relative value of the US dollar based on its 1970 base. So what you can see is that after the end of the Bretton Woods Accord in 1971, the value of the dollar varied wildly on global currency markets, and this affected the purchasing power of OPEC countries because oil is priced in dollars. A reminder throughout my talk, when I talk about the price of oil, I'm talking about the green line, and when I talk about the value of the dollar, I'm talking about the lavender line. One of the interesting things you can see that I first pointed out in 1996 was that when you look at the value of oil and its purchasing power, you can see that there's a floor below which OPEC won't let the value of oil go. And this floor has been rising over time because these countries are becoming ever more first world, but they still have one commodity, which is oil. So they need more purchasing power. I'm going to show several monetary pivot points, which are going to be the two in particular, the end of the Bretton Woods Accord and the Plaza Accord. And that's when the lavender line goes down. And I'm also going to talk about the current pivot point today. So let's start with the Bretton Woods Accord. This is a really important pivot point because this is when the British pound was completely and irrevocably, there we go, no longer the reserve currency of the world. So what happened towards the end of World War II is that the Allies got together and they decided on a post-war currency exchange system, and they fixed the dollar to gold. Member countries had to hold their currency within a 1% trading range, and this becomes very important later on. But foreign central banks could exchange their US dollars for gold at what was called the gold window at that fixed price. So the dollar became as good as gold. And with this and the Marshall Plan, we rebuilt the world. Because remember, at the end of World War II, our enemies, Germany and Japan, their cities and factories were in rubble. Our allies, France and England, their cities and factories were in rubble too. And in the case of England, they were out of gold. Conversely, in America, our factories were never bombed. So the US had all the factories on the planet. We had all the manpower from the GIs coming back from the war, and we had all the gold bullion, so we could rebuild the world. And we did this by refurbishing our plants to make cars and factories and farm implements and toasters and everything else. America became the manufacturing titan of the world. We were the China of our time. We made everything, and we sold it to the world. And if our enemies and our allies didn't have the money to buy these goods, we gave them greenbacks in the form from the Marshall Plan so they could. And once these countries had too much of an accumulation of greenbacks in their central banks, they could take those greenbacks and exchange them for gold bullion, and that's how they recapitalized their banks. Well, this was a wonderful system. We rebuilt the world, and importantly, we rebuilt our allies and our enemies too. Nothing like this had ever happened before. America was the good guys, and we wore a white hat. An important thing to remember is that at the end of World War II, the debt to GDP is as high as it is today. And this was a problem, but they were able to reduce that down to about 40% in just 15 years. And the way they did that was by growing the economy at a sizzling rate of 75% total in real terms, meaning corrected for inflation. And they also intentionally let inflation run a little hot to devalue the war debt. Hopefully you can see how this applies to today. So let's look at the end of Bretton Woods, and this I call the big pivot. Well, it is universally agreed that the war in Vietnam and Johnson's Great Society was the undoing of the Bretton Woods Accord. And the problem with this is not that these weren't good programs made like the Great Society. The problem was that we did not raise taxes to pay for this Great Society. We just printed the money. The other problem was that Johnson removed the gold cover on the dollar. And the problem before this is that for every $4 you wanted to have in circulation, you needed at least $1 of value of gold in Fort Knox. And this was a regulator that kept the politicians from printing too much money. Well, once they got rid of that, the US dollar became a true fiat currency, and they printed a lot of money. So our European allies decry the fact that the US is exporting inflation. And the way this happens is that if we print 10% more of our money, European countries have to print 10% more of their money to keep the currencies within that 1% trading range. It's at this time that France decries what they call, quote, America's exorbitant privilege. That's a famous phrase. And what they meant was that, as de Gaulle said, you Americans, you can just print $100, but if a Frenchman needs $100, he has to go out next for wine or cheese or make a car, do something to create $100 worth of value. So in 1968, France quits the Bretton Woods Accord, France quits NATO, and France trades in all their greenbacks for gold bullion at the gold window at $35 an ounce. Meantime, the price of gold rises to $45 an ounce on the streets of Europe, so European central banks start trading in their greenbacks for gold bullion at $35 an ounce, and then selling that on the streets of Europe for $45 an ounce in greenbacks, and then taking that money back and buying more gold at $35 an ounce, and now you have a run on the gold in Fort Knox. While all this is going on, Nixon is elected president, and Nixon decides he wants more spending and more money printing because he realizes the best way to win the hearts and minds of the American people is to goose the economy. And you get that when you dump more liquidity into the system. And also, Nixon was blessed or cursed by having a Federal Reserve chairman who is widely agreed, it's widely agreed he was the worst Federal Reserve chairman we ever had. And he went along with all this money printing. So the bottom line is by 71, we had a run on the gold in Fort Knox. And by August, everyone is lining up, all the foreign central banks are lining up to redeem their greenbacks for gold bullion at the fixed rate of $35 an ounce. And Nixon realizes there are going to be way too many redemptions for the little bit of gold we have in Fort Knox. And besides that, countries are getting gold on the cheap. So he closes the gold window and Bretton Woods is dead. At this point, it was questionable whether the US dollar would continue to be the world's reserve currency. But in 1973, we got the petrodollar agreement established, and first Saudi Arabia, then later OPEC countries agreed to price their oil in US dollars, and this created a demand for dollars, and it kind of preserved the reserve currency status of the dollar, and it also created a demand for treasuries. But there are several important lessons to be learned. Number one, you cannot print your way to prosperity. It doesn't make any difference whether your goal is a patriotic, noble goal or whether it's a compassionate, noble goal. Either way, when you're printing money, ultimately it ends in inflation and a reduction in the standard of living. The second point is that gold can signal a monetary pivot, rising gold prices. And the third is that people do have a choice. They can quit one currency for a better currency. And in this case, they traded in bad dollars for good gold. So the US goes off the Bretton Woods Accord in 1971, and the lavender line, the value of the dollar drops 21%. So now let's look at this in terms of gold and oil. Gold's on the right in red, oil's on the left in green. Scale in green, and this is in dollars of the day, meaning not corrected for anything. And what you can see is the Bretton Woods Accord ends. The price of gold quickly rises to $100 an ounce. OPEC oil ministers look around and say, "Hey guys, we're chumps. We're charging $3.65 for a barrel of oil when gold has gone up to $100 a barrel." So very quickly, OPEC countries increase the price of oil fourfold in less than 5 years. But look what's going on here. Oil is not leading the price of gold. Oil is following it. And this is important because gold has always been a standard measure of any currency's strength. And gold is the metal with a memory. It records the cumulative effects of inflation over time. So the only thing that OPEC oil producers were doing was maintaining their purchasing power in the face of devaluations of the dollar and inflation. So there you have it. I just explained the early 1970s price of oil, and I didn't say geopolitics, Henry Kissinger, Yom Kippur War. None of that was relevant. We all love Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize, and he makes a big deal about geopolitics at this time, but that didn't really have anything to do with what happened here. This was simply OPEC oil ministers wanting to maintain their purchasing power. You can't even find the word Bretton Woods in Daniel Yergin's book. Now let's go to the Plaza Accord. By 1985, the value of the dollar had surged. The problem with this is it hurt U.S. exports and it favored imports. A Subaru made in Japan was a very cheap car to buy. So there was a meeting of countries in the Plaza Hotel, and they agreed to devalue the dollar. So the dollar skids 60% in 10 years, and the price of oil goes down. And the reason why there's a different response now is because supply is loose. On the previous time when the value of the dollar dropped and the price of oil rose, supplies were tight. Now, if there's too much oil in the market because of the North Sea and the North Slope, there's not much OPEC can do to offset declines in the value of the dollar. But look how in the early 2000s, the value of the dollar skidded 35%, and then supply was tight. And so OPEC was able to increase prices, the green line. There's an important lesson to be learned from the Plaza Accord, and that is that you can boost your exports by depreciating the dollar. Let me explain. We're going to heavy in this the value of the dollar, the lavender line, and I'll just post that on the next slide. So what this slide shows is the value of durable goods in real terms, meaning corrected for inflation. And what you can see is that by 1985, the economy was booming, but durable goods were sagging. In 1985, they're actually lower than they were in 1980. So what's going on? Well, what's going on is that the extremely high value of the dollar was depressing global U.S. exports. And so that's why they devalued the dollar, and you had exports doubled in real terms. It doesn't take a genius to realize, if you listen to what's coming out of the current administration, and if you look at America's trade imbalance, we're not selling enough goods, that obviously they're going to be dollar devaluations. That's going to be the next shoe to drop. So now let's look at the problems of today. This slide is from my 2021 talk, and I'm going to repeat everything I said 4 years ago. Quote, all the problems we have today, we had in the 1960s and 70s, except for one, and that is the national debt, and it's exploded. And this debt is unsustainable. Yes, that's right. That word unsustainable doesn't just apply to environmental policy or energy. These debts and deficits are unsustainable. A big problem is that if all the U.S. debt, meaning the yield on our bonds, resets at 4.5%, then the interest payment alone will consume all federal revenue. So Fed and Treasury are boxed into a corner. Fed can't raise rates to fight inflation, not for very long anyway, and Treasury can't raise yields on bonds to attract people to our bonds. And this doesn't mean we go the way of the Weimar Republic in terms of inflation, but what it means is that there'll be an attitude or bias towards inflation and dollar depreciations. Close quote. So do we have a problem with debt in our bond market? You bet. This is from the Wall Street Journal. Wall Street's sounding the alarm about U.S. debt. Jamie Dimon worries about a crack in the bond market. Jamie Dimon is the chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase. And I need to remind viewers that the bond market is 8 times the stock market. It is Main Street and Wall Street and even more. This is a critical juncture we're coming to. Central banks are dumping treasuries and divorcing from the dollar. What's going on here? Well, they're swapping dollars for gold. Central banks have been on a gold buying binge, the likes of which we haven't seen since the 1960s, back when Bretton Woods was falling apart. Now, this is a cool slide. I didn't show it in my talk in image, but I'm going to develop it. What I'm showing here, what Goldman Sachs shows here, is the yield on the 10-year bond and its real yield, meaning corrected for inflation. And they're increasing yields are going down on this graph. So the lower down it goes to the right, that means the higher the real yield is. And the gold is on the left, and it's showing gold prices going up. And what you see is there's a decoupling here. Ordinarily, when yields on treasuries go negative, people start bidding up gold and buying gold because gold preserves its purchasing power. And you want something that preserves purchasing power, and you don't want to put it into treasuries because they have a negative yield. So that drives the price of gold up. But now that there are strong yields in US dollars, the price of gold is not going down, it's going up. And that's because central banks are buying more and more gold, and that's because they're worried now about confiscation risk. Treasury could fix this problem by paying a risk premium, meaning increasing the yield on Treasury bonds, but then that makes servicing the national debt, the interest on the national debt, even more expensive. The other problem is that U.S. credit has been downgraded, and we've got this pile of debt, and that's also making people shy away from buying more treasuries. So now gold is the second most common reserve asset on the planet, and I think this is a signal for the pivot that we're in now. Here's the problem in a nutshell. The interest payments alone on the national debt are over $1 trillion. That's just for the interest on the national debt. That's more than what we spend on Medicare or on the military. Not both combined, but either one. And the problem is that federal government income is only 3.2 trillion. So you can see on the lower right there, the interest payments alone on the national debt are eating up 1/3 of all the revenue that the government takes in. Now, currently the national debt is 37 trillion and rising quickly. The little secret is that the national debt is never paid off. It's always refinanced and rolled over. That means that we sell bonds to pay for the national debt, and when they mature, then we issue new bonds. Well, we've got $12 trillion in debt that's going to need to be refinanced in the next 12 months. So let's walk through some indicative math. If we roll over all that debt at 1.5% interest, then that generally means that our interest payments are going to be 120 billion, and that adds a little bit of that red column over there in the right-hand corner. If we roll it all over at 4.5%, then that's over $500 billion, and that's adding a lot more. And you can see how that red bar is going to chew up and eat up all the revenue in the government. That's why I said 4 years ago, and that's why I said again today, Fed and Treasury are getting boxed in. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, this is Bill DeMis and he's got some wild idea, but no, that's not really true. After I submitted my abstract to AAPG, Ray Dalio came out with his book, and he's been on the interview circuit, and he says that the interest on our national debt is going to consume all spending. He's saying the same thing I just told you. Now, Ray Dalio did not need to hack into AAPG's computer to come up with this idea. This is an idea that is fairly well recognized just by the simple math. The current problem we have, though, is that neither one of the tribes in Washington, D.C. really wants to talk about this very much, because it means taking away their ability to print money and spend money. Now let's look at the current pivot. One of the good things that's come out of the administration is the Genius Act. And what this does is it sets up a regulatory framework for an official stablecoin that's going to require dollar-for-dollar backing, most likely in treasuries or other instruments that the U.S. government Treasury sells. And this is creating a demand for treasuries without raising yields. So stablecoin companies are already buying T-bills, and they bought $30 or $40 billion, but that's kind of chump change for the kind of investments we need in treasuries to keep our treasuries afloat. So I'll throw out as a speculative idea, what if? What if the government decides that we'll go back to that old petrodollar agreement and we can get oil priced in stable coins? That's trillions of dollars. The amount of transactions in oil every day is a huge amount. So that would create a huge demand for treasuries. Or taking these what if scenarios, what if they decide that all of the commodities on the mercantile are priced in stablecoin? Again, that would create a huge demand for treasuries. There's a whole lot of things happening here, and it's all dynamic. I can't go through them all, but the two things I feel very confident about is we're going to see inflation and we're going to see a lower dollar. So we can take these assumptions and apply them into a price projection scenario using a real global price analysis. So what I've shown here, first off, is just the nominal price of oil, and that means the price of oil in dollars of the day, not corrected for anything, up to today. And then after that, I'm showing the price of oil rising and then plateauing at $75, $150, and $200. Everything to the right of today are projections. Now let's take this nominal data price series and reconvolve that into a real global price analysis using the exact same data. So this is that same data in a real global price analysis. Everything to the left of today is historical. It's baked in. Everything to the right of today, those are all projections. And the projection parameters I'm using is 4.5% inflation, which is significantly less than it was in the 1980s, and just a 15% drop in the dollar. And what you can see is that $200 a barrel oil is kind of in the wheelhouse for where oil prices were during the last tight cycle. You can also put on there OPEC's price floor, and you can see how 75 and even 150 are just entirely too low of a value. Now, I'm not saying that this price evolution will happen over the next 10 years. I'm not saying I even know when it will happen. I'm simply trying to show you how these macroeconomic forces have forced oil to new prices in the past, and I'm showing you how they're going to be operating in the future when supply gets tight. So, summary. A quote that's commonly attributed to Sir Winston Churchill is that you can count on America to do the right thing after they've done everything, after they've tried everything else. Well, so far we've seen both of the tribes in Washington, D.C. pretty much trying everything else and not really focusing on the problem we have, which are these huge annual deficits and this enormous debt that is now consuming a lot of the revenue the government gets. That's why I'm saying we're coming into another big pivot. Ultimately, I know that America is a country of entrepreneurs and inventors, and we will get through this because that's what we Americans do. We're great at innovation. But I'm not saying this because it's like hashtag America exceptionalism or something like that. I'm saying this because that's what history has shown. However, I don't see any scenario in which between now and when we finally stabilize at the end of this pivot, where there isn't going to be quite a bit of tumult and ultimately there will be pain. I wish I wasn't making the predictions I'm making today, but since I gave my talk in 2021, I've seen that the conditions have gotten worse than they were last time. Ultimately, though, I'm optimistic that the dollar will remain the reserve currency of the world and that we will get through this, but it will not be without tumult. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Bill. That's a very informative talk and actually quite sobering. But so I know that you don't have any recommendations for investments, but I started thinking about the 1970s situations and stagflation and just was wondering if some of the same strategies that were prevalent then would make sense now.
A common theme, I'm not going to make any specific recommendations. A common theme I've heard from people smarter than me is that we're entering a cycle of commodities because people
Mhm.
will want to be in hard assets. The 1970s in America are probably not the best model to understand what happens when you go through these devaluations and currency money printing. Probably the best example would be Argentina, where they've been printing money wildly and their stock markets exploded. And one of the things that this is something von Mises, a famous economist, talks about. One of the things you can probably expect to see is as there's more money printing, you see every time they release more money, it always gooses the stock market, which is why we have these huge valuations in the stock market. Since COVID hit, the value of the stock market, the U.S. stock market's gone from 40 trillion to 65 trillion. I mean, that
Yeah.
$25 trillion increase in the stock market is greater than all the other value of all the other stock markets in the world, excluding China. So ultimately, you'll see a rise in the stock market and in commodities both, I think.
I agree. I think that obviously there are going to be corrections, but if you just look long term, it totally makes sense. The other thing too that from an energy perspective, I mean, in terms of exports, et cetera, we don't really export like we did in the 70s. We have a different industrial base. And in order for us to expand, and we talk about data centers, but it really comes to everything, we need more electricity. So, from an oil industry perspective, I totally applaud the all of the above approaches to like natural gas fired electricity and everything, geothermal. What do you think?
So to your first point, America still has a huge industrial base, and our durable goods exports have been climbing, and They plateaued in about the last 8 years, but America still does export a lot. I mean, it's a surprising the number of even automobiles we export in this country. Um,
Good
Ultimately,
to know.
there's going to be continued reshoring, and I think you're right that you need to have energy that can. It's not just data centers. You need to have inexpensive energy so that it drives down the cost of the goods you make, and it
Yes,
also frees up consumers, frees up the amount of money consumers have to go spend on stuff. And
exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. And it's been a little bit alarming, at least in Oklahoma, to see the cost of electricity rise precisely because there is more demand due to data centers, which to me means that we've got to expand our capacity. And as we do so, we can use
yes.
our innovation and inventive spirit to come up with better ways to do so.
Yes, America is the country of innovation. That's why, even though I have to admit, my message is kind of a bummer. And like I said 4 years
Yes.
ago, I really kind of hope I'm wrong. The thing to remember too, though, is that I think ultimately there's going to be pushback from the consumers where they're going to say to Mr. Microsoft and Mr. Facebook and Mr. Google, hey, that's fine. You guys want to build an AI center. That's great, but you're not going to plug it into our utility grid. You guys build your
Yeah.
own 5 or 8 gigawatts of power, and we don't care how you do it, but you can't keep making us, the consumers, pay for your data center so you can make money helping everyone, put their relatives' faces on cat videos or whatever they're going to be doing with AI.
100% agree. Well, thank you, Bill. This has been really great. And if people want to get in touch with you, I'm glad you mentioned your LinkedIn page. And also, how else can they get in touch with you?
You can find me out in the AAPG membership directory.
Perfect. Great. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. Always a pleasure.
Thanks.